This is the lecture for the lymphatic and the immune system. All right, so between the two, okay, I think most students kind of know what the immune system is. Right, it's that system in our body that helps protect us from infection, from microorganisms. Now, the lymphatic system is closely related to the immune system, and it's a system that takes excess tissue fluid or fluid that has leaked out of your blood vessels, and it returns them back to the subclavian veins in your neck. Okay, so let's talk about the two systems, starting off with the lymphatic system. So it's a network of conduits, all right, passageways, vessels, basically, that carry a clear fluid called lymph. All right, so in this figure we see here, we see an arterial, we see a capillary bed, and we see a venule. All right, and on this arterial side of a capillary, there's lots of hydrostatic pressure because, again, the heart is over here. All right, so as the heart beats and creates pressure, right, it then forces blood, right, to travel through these very small vesseled capillaries. Now, because of the buildup of hydrostatic pressure, okay, water tends to filter out on the arterial side of a capillary. Okay. Now, what typically happens, though, right, is that we see water re-entering on the venule side. So, again, because we have the heart over here on this arterial side, okay, we create hydrostatic pressure, all right, and that hydrostatic pressure causes water to be filtered out on the arterial side. Okay. Now, because of the plasma proteins and because of colloidal osmotic pressure, water then typically gets reabsorbed on the venule side. The thing is, though, the amount of water that gets filtered out on this arterial side is not equal to the amount of water that gets reuptaken, right, on the venule side. So that means there's fluid left outside here, okay? And that fluid that bathes and surrounds our cells, again, we call that interstitial fluid. All right? The thing is, though, if we don't, okay, do anything about this, that interstitial fluid keeps building up and it keeps building up and it keeps building up. Well, this clear fluid we call lymph, all right, would then cause us to start to swell up. Okay, it would lead to a condition called edema. All right, so we need another system that takes up the excess tissue fluid that's being filtered out here on this arterial side and returns it back to your blood. Okay, so the name of that system, we call that the lymphatic system. All right, so we can see here in this figure here, these look like green vessels, right? These will take up the excess tissue fluid and return it back to your bloodstream, return it back to your blood, so that we do not suffer from swelling, so we don't suffer from edema. All right. So the main structures that we think about when we think about the lymphatic system, we think about lymphatic vessels. Okay, and there's a series that we'll talk about that lead that excess tissue fluid called lymph, that lead that fluid back to your subclavian veins. Okay, so what do these vessels do besides transport lymph? Well, they transport proteins that have escaped from the capillaries back to the heart. All right. Now, they also provide a means, okay, that disease organisms and disease cells can travel through the body. Okay, so if, for example, some type of microorganism gets into your body and it enters your lymphatic system, well, that's going to lead to your blood. All right, so we can kind of see where the intersect between lymphatic and immune is going to be. By the time the lymph reaches your subclavian veins, you got to make sure there's no microorganisms in there. Okay, because once it reaches your blood, well, that's a bad thing, right? Now, disease cells, what are those? Well, then cancer cells. So we've heard of this idea of metastasis, the idea that cancer can spread from one part of your body to another part of your body. So how do those cancer cells get into your blood, right? Well, they took a ride in the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system, again, ultimately ends up in your subclavian veins, right? So yes, there's a good part of the lymphatic system, but then we see this kind of bad part where things can now, okay, get into your cardiovascular system, get into your blood. Now, on a side note, what else do these lymphatic vessels do? Well, they carry absorbed fat from your intestines back to your blood. So when you eat a fatty meal, that fat doesn't necessarily get directly into your blood in your capillaries. It takes a ride in the lymphatic system, travels through your lymphatic system, and eventually reaches your blood in your subclavian veins. Okay. All right. So the second part of this packet, in addition to the lymphatic system, is the immune system. All right. So the immune system consists of cells. We call those lymphocytes. Excuse me. White blood cells. We think about the B cells and the T cells. It also has lymphoid tissue, and so this is tissue that has the lymphocytes, that has those B cells and T cells. And then we have lymphoid organs. Example, your spleen, your thymus, your lymph nodes, tonsils, appendix. These would all have lymphoid tissue, okay? And in some cases also have then these lymphocytes. So the function of the immune system is to contain and destroy diseased organisms. All right. So this is of particular importance, specifically today, in the climate of COVID-19. Well, this is the system that's going to save your ass, basically. Okay. All right. So starting off with the lymphatic system. So here is a figure, and that figure shows us, well, here is the heart. Okay. These are arteries, right? This here is the capillaries and the capillary bed, and then these are the veins that return the blood back to the heart. Okay, so when we think about your cardiovascular system, okay, it's a closed circuit, meaning that, okay, it goes in a circle in this case, right? Now, when you think about your lymphatic system, right, it doesn't go in a circuit. It actually essentially goes in a single direction, right? So it goes from sites of blood capillaries and returns that lymph, okay, back to your subclavian veins in your neck. All right, so it only flows towards the heart, basically. It doesn't go away from the heart like here, like the arteries. Okay, it only goes towards the heart. So what are the orders of lymphatic vessels? So closest to the capillaries, we see these ones here in green. Well, these are the lymph capillaries. All right, so these are the smallest. These are the first ones that receive the lymph, okay? From the lymph capillaries, we then have these vessels. Okay, I'm going to trace it until I reach the end. Okay, we call these then the lymphatic collecting vessels. Okay, and the lymphatic collecting vessels, they have valves. So if I were to zoom in on one of these valves, see there's a valve there. Okay, so that ensures that the lymph only travels in a single direction towards the heart. It's never going to go back towards the capillaries, for example, right? Also scattered along these lymphatic collecting vessels, you see these larger structures here. Well, these larger structures are the lymph nodes, okay? And these lymph nodes, these are the immune system organs that we're going to talk about next after we talk about the lymphatic system. So what we want to make sure is that as we're uptaking this excess tissue fluid that has been filtered out of your capillaries, okay, it's very possible that this lymph has microorganisms. So as this lymph, possibly containing microorganisms, is traveling back towards your blood, what the lymph nodes do, they filter the lymph of microorganisms. So by the time the lymph reaches your subclavian vein, okay, we've now gotten rid of these microorganisms. Okay, we don't want microorganisms traveling within your cardiovascular system. All right. Now, what happens when a lymphatic collecting vessel merges with another lymphatic collecting vessel? Well, you become what's called a lymph trunk. Okay, lymph trunks aren't particularly very long. Okay, it's basically where two lymphatic or more lymphatic collecting vessels merge, you form what's called a lymph trunk. Okay, now lymph trunks, so let's say here's a lymph trunk and here's another lymph trunk. When lymph trunks merge, you form what's called a lymph duct. And that lymph duct then is what feeds into the subclavian veins. Okay, so you have the lymph capillaries closest to your blood capillaries. You then have what are called the lymphatic collecting vessels, which have valves and lymph nodes scattered along them. And then when two lymphatic collecting vessels merge, you form what's called a lymph trunk. Okay, when two lymph trunks or more merge together, you form what's called a lymph duct. And that lymph duct then deposits the lymph into your subclavian veins. Okay, all right, so start off towards the bottom here. Let's start off closest to the blood capillaries. Let's talk about the lymph capillaries. All right, so these are closed-ended vessels, all right, consisting of a single layer of endothelial cells, all right? So it's lined with a simple squamous epithelium. Now, these lymphatic collecting vessels that you guys can see in green here, they're so absorptive that scientists first believed that these lymphatic capillaries, these lymph capillaries were open-ended vessels and not closed-ended, all right? So why did they think that they were open-ended? Because they uptake so many things. They uptake fluid, they uptake proteins, they uptake cells, okay? They must be like straws, okay? When you think of a straw, it's open-ended, right? But when you look closely at a lymph capillary, it's not open-ended, it's actually closed-ended, all right? So that astounded scientists, like, whoa, wow, okay? How can a cell get in here? How can a microorganism get in here? How can leaked plasma proteins get in here if it's a closed-ended vessels? Well, the reason why lymph capillaries are so permeable, okay, is that it has these mini valves here, right? So think of like gills on a fish that open and close whenever the fish breathes, basically, right? So these little mini valves, okay, are like overlaps between the endothelial cells. So here's a mini valve here, there's one here, okay, there's another here, there's another here. So these can open, allowing cells to enter, allowing lymph to enter, allowing plasma proteins to enter, allowing microorganisms to enter. All right. So by having the mini valves that open and close, that allow the fluid to enter. So they're very highly permeable. All right. So this is how we initially uptake the lymph. We use these lymph capillaries that are intimately associated with our blood capillaries. All right. Now there's a special type of lymph capillary found within your small intestine, okay, and we call these lymph capillaries here, we call these in green, we call these lacteals. All right, so let's kind of show the picture that we have here in the figure. Okay, so this is our simple columnar epithelium, all right, and on the top we see, right, the little villi here. All right, so this is what do these represent in the small intestine? Well, these are villi. Okay, these are structures within the mucosa of your small intestine. Right, so this is what lines your small intestine. So as food, okay, passes through, as chyme passes through your small intestine, well, then we absorb the nutrients, okay? And we have these capillaries here within our mucosa. So if those nutrients are water soluble, well, then we can absorb them directly into our blood. However, if we have a fatty meal and there's fats, right, in that chyme, well, we're not going to absorb the fat directly into our blood, into the capillaries of your small intestine. That fat is initially absorbed within this lymph capillary in green we call a lacteal, okay? And that lacteal, okay, absorbs fat from your diet and it mixes with the lymph. We call that fatty lymph. We call that chyle. Okay? So as the fat and the lymph mix together, we call that fatty lymph. We call it chyle. All right, so from the lymph capillaries, where do we go? Well, then we go to the lymphatic collecting vessels. Okay, so these are the ones that have the valves. These are the ones that have the lymph nodes scattered along them. Okay, so these ones accompany your blood vessels. They travel kind of the same route that your blood vessels do. Okay, very deep and superficial. Okay, composed of what? Well, the three tunics that make up your blood vessels. What are the name of the three tunics that make up your blood vessels? Well, we have a tunica intima, which would line the lumen, right, here of your lymphatic collecting vessels. We have a tunica media. The tunica media consists of smooth muscle, right? So we can have like a constriction or dilation. And then the outer layer here, well, then we would call that the tunica externa or the tunica adventitia, okay? Now, even though they have the same three tunics, they also have what? Well, their walls are a lot thinner than the walls of your blood vessels. Well, why would that be? Well, because of the walls of your blood vessels have to be thicker because of the increased blood pressure, the pressure that is within your lymphatic collecting vessels, okay, or within your blood vessels, okay. So because the pressure is greater in your blood vessels, you need a thicker tunica media. Because the pressure is lower within your lymphatic collecting vessels, right, these three tunics are going to be thinner. The walls of your lymphatic collecting vessels are going to be thinner, okay. Also, because there's very little pressure within your lymphatic collecting vessels, we need valves, right? Just like there's no very little pressure in your veins, you need valves. Okay, we want to make sure we have one-way flow or unidirectional flow of lymph. Okay. You also can see here that some of your lymphatic collecting vessels have mini valves, so even lymphatic collecting vessels can absorb lymph from the surrounding tissue. All right. So how do we get lymph to travel through your lymphatic collecting vessels if there is very little pressure? All right. So how does that happen? Well, we need mechanisms to do that. Okay. So one of them is what? Well, remember that these lymphatic collecting vessels, they accompany the blood vessels. They travel along your arteries. They travel along with your veins, right? And with your arteries have pressure, so they pulse, right? So whatever you feel for a pulse, for example, you're feeling for that pressure fluctuating within your arteries. So imagine here, okay, if we had, for example, okay, an artery traveling right next to this lymphatic collecting vessel. Okay, so here's an artery right here traveling right next to it, and this artery, as the pressure increases, decreases, it expands, and then it retracts. So as it expands, it's going to push up against this lymphatic collecting vessel. It's going to squeeze this lymphatic collecting vessel, and as this lymphatic collecting vessel is squeezed, what happens is that it causes the lymph now to get propelled, to move. Okay, and it's only going to move in a single direction again, because of the fact that you guys have these valves here. Okay? All right. Another one, okay, that was actually B. Another one is the bulging of skeletal muscles. So as you move your body, okay, as your muscles flex and extend, okay, they're going to squeeze on the lymphatic collecting vessels, causing then the lymph to be moved and propel. All right? And then the last one, part C here, what? Well, we said that it has the three same tunics as the blood vessels. So we know that within the tunica media, all right, we have smooth muscle. Okay, so we can have the same kind of effect of vasoconstriction or vasodilation occurring here. Okay, in this case, constriction. As we squeeze, okay, using that tunica media, we then propel the lymph, right, within our lymphatic collecting vessels here. All right. Now, scattered along the lymphatic collecting vessels, if we go back to this slide here, for example, scattered along the lymphatic collecting vessels, not only do we have valves, we also have these structures here. These are called lymph nodes, okay? And the lymph nodes are bean-shaped organs, all right, scattered along lymphatic collecting vessels that cleanse the lymph of pathogens, all right? Cleanse the lymph of viruses, cleanse the lymph of bacteria, for example, all right? So by the time the lymph reaches your subclavian veins that they highlighted here in blue, okay, we make sure we have a clean lymph. We don't want any microorganisms or pathogens traveling within our cardiovascular system. So there are approximately 500 of these lymph nodes. Okay, they're scattered along, okay, different parts. Okay, for example, here in your neck, we call these ones the cervical nodes. We have some in your armpits here. We call these ones the axillary nodes. Okay, we have some in, for example, your groin region here. We call these the inguinal nodes, so forth and so on. So as the lymph ultimately is trying to reach your subclavian veins, by the time it reaches the subclavian veins, okay, that lymph has been cleared of any type of pathogens. Okay? All right, so if we look closely at a lymph node, again, it's a bean-shaped organ. We have about 500 of these scattered throughout your entire body. Okay? The outer part, okay, is surrounded by a fibrous capsule. Okay? We call this actually, right here, this outer region here, this is called the cortex. Okay? In the middle part here, we call this the medulla. Now, or the medullary sinus. In here, we're going to find what? Well, we're going to find, okay, fibrous strands, okay, within that capsule of our lymph node, right, that kind of support and give shape to our lymph nodes. Now, inside of our lymph node, okay, we're going to then have reticular fibers, okay? If you guys remember what reticular fibers do way back in the day, they're not like collagen fibers. Collagen fibers support. They're not elastic fibers. Elastic fibers allow to, okay, recoil, snap back into shape. Okay, reticular fibers support. Okay, so you have a network of reticular fibers in here supporting what? Well, they're going to support, right, macrophages. They're going to support B cells and T cells, right? So as the lymph enters your lymph node, we have macrophages in there. We have B cells in here. We have T cells that help cleanse the lymph of any type of pathogens. Okay? Now notice that one side of your lymph node is convex. Another side of your lymph node here is concave. So we have a convex side of your lymph node, and we have a concave side of your lymph node. Okay? So lymph enters on the convex side. Okay? And feeding your lymph node of lymph, we have these vessels here. These are called the afferent lymphatic vessels. Okay? So you kind of think of these as carrying a dirtier lymph. Okay? Possibly containing, okay, some microorganisms. So as we now purge and cleanse that lymph of microorganisms, we then drain the lymph node on the concave side using these vessels here. Well, these vessels are called the efferent lymphatic vessels. Okay, you can kind of think of these carrying a cleaner lymph, all right, because we've already passed through the lymph nodes. So you have an afferent lymphatic vessel, you have a lymph node, and then you have an efferent lymphatic vessel. Okay? All right, so what happens when lymphatic collecting vessels merge? Okay, so we go back to this slide here. Okay, when one lymphatic collecting vessel and another lymphatic collecting vessel merge, you form what's called a lymph trunk. All right, so in your body, okay, you have 5 major lymph trunks. All right, so starting inferiorly, starting at the bottom here, let's start off with the lumbar trunks. Okay, and the lumbar trunks are paired. You have a right lumbar trunk and you have a left lumbar trunk. So this is going to receive lymph from your lower limbs, from your legs, from your pelvic organs, and from your anterior abdominal wall. So we can see here coming from the right, again, this is anatomical position. Here in green would be the right lumbar trunk. Okay, here coming from the left in green, this would be the left lumbar trunk. Okay, so the right lumbar trunk and the left lumbar trunk are right here. Okay. Now, coming up the middle right here in green, okay, is an unpaired trunk. We call this one the intestinal trunk. Okay, so the intestinal trunk is going to receive the chyle coming from the digestive organs. Okay, so again, if we look at what that means, remember, these are called lacteals. These are specialized lymph capillaries you find within your intestines. Okay, and they receive fat from your diet. Okay, so we take lymph and we take fat, now we have a fatty lymph, we call that chyle. Okay, so ultimately that chyle makes it to where? It's going to make it to this intestinal trunk right here. Okay, so again, this is unpaired, there's only one of them. You see it right there. Okay, now the next ones are the bronchomediastinal trunk, and these ones are also paired, so there's a right bronchomediastinal and there's a left bronchomediastinal. Okay, these collect lymph from the thoracic viscera. Okay, so from your chest, basically. All right, so we see here on the right in green, here's the right bronchomediastinal trunk. Here on the left, here you can see the left in green bronchomediastinal trunk. Okay, so again, these ones are paired. You then have the subclavian trunks. Also, again, these are paired. You have a right subclavian trunk and you have a left subclavian trunk. Okay, so these are going to receive lymph from your arms, your upper limbs, and the superior thoracic wall, so the upper regions of your chest, okay, and also near the base of the neck. So here we see coming from the right in green, here's your right subclavian trunk. Here coming from the left, here's your left subclavian trunk, okay. And the 5th major lymph trunk is the jugular trunks. Okay, so again, these ones are paired, so you have a right jugular trunk and you have a left jugular trunk. These are going to drain lymph from your head and your neck. Okay, so here we see the right jugular trunk in green. Here we see the left jugular trunk in green. Okay. All right, so what happens when trunks merge? Well, then you form what are called ducts. All right. So lymphatic trunks merge together and they drain into what are called lymphatic ducts, and it's the lymphatic ducts that then drain the lymph into your subclavian veins. All right, so everybody has what's called a thoracic duct. Okay, so thoracic duct, right, is formed when what? Well, if we go over here, okay, so here is your right lumbar trunk, here's your left lumbar trunk, and here is your intestinal trunk. Okay, so when these merge, right here is the beginning of your thoracic duct Okay, so your thoracic duct ascends along the vertebral bodies of your thoracic vertebra. So we're going to go up, 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 and then we're going to start going towards the left here. Okay, so right here, what I've traced from here, where all these three trunks have merged, here's the beginning of your thoracic duct. It goes up along, okay, the anterior portions of your thoracic vertebra, okay, and it starts hanging a left right here. Okay, where it merges with the left jugular trunk, the left, okay, subclavian trunk, and the left bronchomediastinal trunk. So you see that this thoracic duct right here, okay, is now feeding the lymph into your left subclavian vein. Okay, so the thoracic duct drains basically 3/4 of your body. It drains all the inferior parts, okay, and it drains, okay, kind of the left side superior part of your body. All right. Now, you also have what's called possibly a right lymphatic duct. Okay, it's only present in 20% of the population, 20% of people. All right. So everybody has a thoracic duct, okay, but not everybody has a right lymphatic duct. Okay, so the right lymphatic duct is formed when what? Well, here on the right side, when the right bronchomediastinal trunk, the right subclavian trunk, and the right jugular trunk merge. So when those three trunks merge, it's a very short one right here. We call this right here, okay, the right lymphatic duct. Okay, and the right lymphatic duct feeds the lymph now into your right subclavian vein. Again, only 20% of the people have this. So what does that mean for the remaining 80% of the people? Well, it means that these three trunks do not merge together. It means that the right bronchomediastinal trunk, the right subclavian, the right jugular, they simply feed their lymph directly into the right subclavian vein. They don't merge together. All right? So in that case, if they don't merge, well, they don't form the right lymphatic duct. Okay? All right. So what's the summary, okay, in terms of our lymphatic system? Well, number one, it returns excess tissue fluid back to the bloodstream so that we don't suffer from a condition called edema. All right. If you were to have to damage your blood vessels and your plasma proteins leak out, okay, how do we get those plasma proteins back into your blood? Well, we're going to use the lymphatic system. All right. Also, what? Well, it carries absorbed fat from the intestine to the blood. When we think about the lacteals in your small intestine and the fatty lymph called chyle that's created. All right. So those are the functions we primarily think about when we think about the lymphatic system. Now, you also have to think about what? Well, because the lymphatic collecting vessels have these lymph nodes on them, and these lymph nodes have macrophages, and they have B cells, and they have T cells. Well, this is an immune system organ. So there's an intersect now between the lymphatic system and your immune system. So in addition to that, we fight disease, okay, and we have a role in the immune system. Okay, so this is a good point now to what? This is a good point to now start talking about, right, the immune system. All right, so again, this is of particular importance nowadays, especially with the pandemic and COVID-19. All right, so what is this system all about? Okay, how does it make us, quote unquote, immune to something that we've been sick, right, or been infected with already? Well, this is a system that recognizes and attacks specific molecules and destroys pathogens more and more effectively with new exposure. Okay, so again, if something foreign were to enter your body, it's a system that gets activated. Okay, and we start generating cells, okay, that are able to recognize these foreign substances within our body. So that if that substance, whatever it is, okay, a pathogen, for example, re-enters your body, right, we do what? Well, we recognize it, right, and we destroy that pathogen. And if it happens again, well, we're even stronger in our response. If it happens again, we get even stronger in our response. Okay? So the first time around when it got us sick, well, we weren't ready. We didn't have the proper cells, okay, there to recognize and destroy it before that pathogen was able to replicate and get us, okay, ill. The second time it comes around, well, what happens? Well, we don't give it a chance to replicate. We don't give it a chance, okay, to overtake our body. because we recognized it, okay, early in the infection. So what are the components of this immune system? Well, these are the lymphocytes, right? The B cells and the T cells. These are the tissues that house the lymphocytes. We call that lymphoid tissue. Okay, and then we have the organs that have the lymphoid tissue. We call those the lymphoid organs. All right. So recall from 2 chapters. Chapter 4, which talked about tissues, okay, where we talked specifically about epithelial tissues, for example, and connective tissue. Okay, and then chapter 17, which we covered, which talked about blood. All right. So from chapter 4, okay, we know that there's these tissues. One is called an epithelial tissue. Okay, so in this case, we see a simple cuboidal epithelium. And we know that there's 2 sides to this. It has polarity. One side is exposed to a free space. We call that the apical side of this epithelium. Another side of the epithelium is supported by a connective tissue. In this case, this is areolar. Well, we call this the basal side of the epithelium. And on the basal side, we have this areolar connective tissue right here. Okay? So with areolar, right, we know that what? Well, it has different functions, right? It holds body fluids, right? It stores energy in the form of fat. It binds and supports. And there was a 4th function. Well, it helps what? Protect against infection from microorganisms. So why is that? Well, because areolar, okay, has what? It has mast cells present within it. It has plasma cells present within it. It has macrophages present within it. Okay? So if something were to break through this epithelium, we now have cells that are ready to fight, okay, that particular pathogen. Okay? So we initiate what's called the inflammatory response. Okay? Kind of what's called our innate immune system, essentially. Okay? The ability, okay, to kind of first initially, okay, destroy them using, for example, macrophages. Now, the second part of that, though, okay, is that you also find lymphocytes here. Okay? White blood cells that recognize and attack, okay, specific foreign molecules. And why is that? Well, because these microorganisms bear what are called antigens. All right? So if we go here, okay, and we start to draw, for example, all right, so let's say here is some type of microorganism. All right? And bearing on its surface, we have, markers. We have these little proteins expressed here. All right? Well, these are called antigens right there. So if this was something that infected us, okay, a while day, for example, here's a plasma cell, okay, what that plasma cell will do, it'll create what are called antibodies. Okay, and those antibodies will bind to these antigens expressed on the surface of this, in this case, a bacteria. Okay, well, then what happens there? Well, we talked about this before. Here comes another cell, okay, called a macrophage. Okay, and that macrophage does what? Well, then it phagocytizes this, okay, pathogen. All right, so the lymphocytes are able to recognize these markers expressed on the surface of these pathogens, and we call those markers, again, antigens. All right. All right, so there's 2 main classes of lymphocytes. Again, you guys should know this already because we talked about it in our blood lecture, right? There's T cells, and there are what are called B cells. T cells and B cells, all right? So the T cells, aka the killer T lymphocytes, again, you got to be badass if your name is Killer, right? They're going to attack foreign eukaryotic cells by, again, recognizing the antigen, okay, and punching holes in the membrane. So here's a T cell. Again, it's not activated yet, and what happens? It recognizes these antigens expressed on the surface of this pathogen, okay? So we see that interaction occurring where that T cell recognizes the antigen right there, okay? It then does what? It punches holes, right, in the plasma membrane of this eukaryotic cell, okay? And it backs up and says, what's up, right? And basically, this eukaryotic cell is damaged so much that it can't repair itself, okay? And it undergoes, okay, a process called apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, right? So here we see that cell dying right there. All right, the second class of lymphocytes are called B cells, right? And B cells, okay, when activated, become plasma cells. And these plasma cells secrete these proteins called antibodies, And these antibodies then what? Well, then they bind to the antigens expressed on the surface, in this case of bacteria. Okay, and again, it's not the antibodies that will then kill the bacteria directly. It's what? Okay, it's macrophages that then see that happening, and the macrophages then come over and then phagocytize the pathogen. In this case, phagocytize the bacteria. Okay? So again, why is this so important? Why are the B cells so important? Why are the T cells so important? Because they have the ability to recognize specific markers called antigens expressed on the surface of these pathogens. So we don't give these pathogens an opportunity, okay, to replicate and get us sick. We basically squash them at the very initial, okay, stages of infection. All right. So how does that happen? How does a B cell and how does the T cells, how do they kind of recognize, okay, that a foreign pathogen has entered your body? How do we activate a B cell? How do we activate a T cell? Okay. So we know that your lymphocytes originate where? Well, they originate in the red bone marrow, okay, found within or in between the spongy bone of our bones. Okay. And we know that a process called hematopoiesis, again, occurs within that red bone marrow, okay, where all of the blood cells are going to be made. Red blood cells, okay, platelets, right? The different types of white blood cells, basophils, eosinophils, neutrophils, okay, monocytes, right? And also lymphocytes are created in the red bone marrow. Okay, and you guys remember that blood lecture, okay, how we start to differentiate where a hematopoietic stem cell can either become what? Okay, a myeloid stem cell, okay, or a lymphoid stem cell, okay, or a lymphocyte stem cell. Now, if you become a lymphocyte stem cell, well, you're going to become a lymphocyte. You're going to become a B cell, or you're going to become a T cell. You become a myeloid stem cell, on the other hand, well, you're going to become any one of the other formed elements, red blood cells all the way down to platelets, all right? So since we're talking about lymphocytes, well, we're talking about these lymphoid stem cells. We're talking about the lymphocyte stem cells. So let's say, okay, you're, okay, a lymphoid stem cell. You're going to become either a B cell or a T cell. And you say to yourself, well, yeah, you know, I like the bone. That's where I'm from, right? I'm going to stay in the bone marrow. Well, if that's the case, okay, if you're a lymphoid stem cell and you stay in the bone, you're going to become a B lymphocyte. Bone, B cell. However, let's say you're a lymphoid stem cell, like, yeah, you know, okay, I like the bone marrow. That's where I'm from. Okay, I always rep the bone marrow. But, you know, I want to go other places. So let's say you're a lymphoid stem cell and you now travel to the thymus. Okay, and the thymus you can see is right here. Okay, kind of at the base, okay, in your chest, the base of your neck, right? So you go from the red bone marrow and you now enter the thymus. Well, now you're going to become what's called a T cell, a T lymphocyte. Okay? So again, if you're a lymphoid stem cell and you stay in the bone marrow, you can become a B cell. If you leave the bone marrow and you enter your thymus, well, then you become a T cell. Okay? So what do you do there once you stay in the bone marrow and become a B cell, or you go to the thymus, you become a T cell? Well, you're going to divide rapidly. Okay, you're going to generate families of B cells. You're going to generate families of T cells. Okay, and what are you going to do? Well, you're going to go to, okay, thymus school. You're going to go to bone marrow school, where you're going to learn something called immunocompetence. So what's immunocompetence? It's the ability, okay, to recognize your antigen. All right? So you got sick from something, and your body says, well, we're not going to get sick from that thing again. That thing that got us sick, well, here's its antigen. All right? And you're going to teach your B lymphocytes in the bone marrow, well, this is an antigen that you need to recognize. Okay, so remember, every B cell and every T cell recognizes a unique specific antigen. So that means you have lots of B cells that all recognize different antigens. You have lots of T cells that all recognize different antigens. So the initial part where you're teaching your B cells and you're teaching your T cells to recognize their antigen, we call that immunocompetence. Okay? So in the bone marrow, B cells gain their immunocompetence. In the thymus, okay, T cells gain their immunocompetence. The ability to recognize their own unique specific antigen. All right, now, do you think right, we're going to be fighting infection in your bone marrow, fighting infection in your thymus. You think that's where the battle is going to occur, within your thymus and within your bone marrow? Okay, and the answer is no, right? So what you have to do, once you've gained immunocompetence, you're going to leave the thymus, you're going to leave the bone marrow, and you're going to now seed various lymphoid tissues that are present in your body. You're going to go to a lymph node and hang out there, right? You're going to go to the spleen and hang out there. You're going to go, okay, to your appendix and hang out there. You're going to wait in places where battles will occur, okay? So you kind of think of the bone marrow and the thymus as the schools where you learn something, right? You don't expect a battle to occur at West Point, okay? You're going to now graduate from West Point and you're going to go somewhere else where a battle is going to occur, okay? So in that case, you leave the bone marrow, you leave the thymus, now you enter the appendix, you enter the lymph nodes, you enter, right, your tonsils, for example, right? And you wait for what? You sit there. You wait for days. You wait for weeks with nothing going on. You wait for months, nothing goes on. You wait for years, nothing goes on. You wait for decades, nothing goes on, okay? Because that thing that got you sick in kindergarten, okay, you haven't seen yet again. And then in college, what happens? Well, then that thing tries to get you sick. And what happens is you have what's called an antigenic challenge, where the lymphocyte meets and binds again to its specific antigen. And what happens, that B cell and that T cell, they get pissed off, like, oh, wow, you got us sick back in kindergarten. You're trying to get us sick now in college again. What's up, right? So they're challenged now, okay, a second time, or a third time, or a fourth time, where they get fully activated, okay? So what challenges, okay, these B cells or T cells? Okay, well, macrophage can phagocytize something and say, well, look, this is what I found. Does this belong to anybody? Okay, do you guys remember there's a cell in your skin, specifically in your epidermis, specifically within, okay, the stratum spinosum, called a Langerhans cell. And that Langerhans cell patrols that stratum spinosum. Okay, and it phagocytizes something via receptor-mediated endocytosis. What does it do? It exits and enters the lymph node. And then it challenges, right, the cell and says, hey, this is what I found in the skin. Does this belong to anybody? Right? And when a B cell or T cell says, oh yeah, that's mine, right? They get activated. And they divide and they divide. And they start, okay, searching out in your body, basically a search and destroy mission, looking again for more of those pathogens bearing that antigen. Okay? So we call a macrophage, we call a Langerhans cell, we call a microglial cell. You guys, remember, we find those in your nervous system. Those are called antigen presenting cell. So they present the antigen to the lymphocyte, the B cell or T cell. We activate that B cell or T cell. Okay? We divide, and then we now spread throughout the entire body, looking again for more pathogens bearing that same antigen. All right. So, what does it mean when we say we get activated? Well, we divide. Well, that's one thing that happens, right? Now, when we divide, we replicate ourselves, right? Now, there's two different types of cell classes or clones that we produce when we get activated, right? So, a B cell or T cell, they're going to both produce what are called effector lymphocytes and memory lymphocytes. Okay, so let's say we got presented with our antigen, okay, by an antigen presenting cell. We were just sitting there. We haven't seen this thing for like 10 years. Okay, and all of a sudden, boom, it's back in our body. Well, as a B cell or T cell, you're going to divide. You're going to produce clones. But some of those clones will be effector lymphocytes. Some of those will be memory lymphocytes. So what's the difference between the two? Well, for effector lymphocytes, these ones are short-lived cells that respond to the pathogen immediately and they die. They're the ones that take care of the immediate threat, basically. Oh, wow, this thing's in our body. We got to get rid of it right now. We call those the effector lymphocytes. Okay? So if you're a B cell, your effector lymphocyte, well, we call that a plasma cell. Okay? These are the ones that secrete antibodies. The antibodies bind, okay, marking them for phagocytosis by a macrophage. Okay? So that's the effector version of a B cell. Okay, what's the effector lymphocyte version for a T cell? Well, T cells produce two different types of effector lymphocytes. They produce the cytotoxic T cells. Again, these are the killer T cells. So these are the ones that are going to punch holes in the plasma membrane, causing apoptosis. Okay, you'll also produce what are called helper T cells. Okay, so whereas the B cells only produce one type of effector lymphocyte, plasma cells, T cells, when activated, produce two types of effector lymphocytes: killer T cells and helper T cells. All right. So we know what the killer T cells do. These are the ones that cause the apoptosis, right? Okay. Helper T cells, also known as CD4 positive cells. Okay. These ones produce a chemical known as cytokines. Okay. And cytokines, okay, amplify the immune response. What do cytokines do? They stimulate the proliferation of more B cells, of more T cells, of more macrophages. So they amplify your immune response. All right. So you probably heard of something called HIV and AIDS. Okay, AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, right? You got it from somewhere. So what does the HIV virus do? Does it target B cells? Does it target killer T cells? Okay. It actually targets what? It targets these helper T cells. So if the virus kills these helper T cells, you don't produce cytokines. Well, if you don't produce cytokines, you cannot then call for backup. You can't call for more B cells. You can't call for more killer T cells. You can't call for macrophages. So essentially you have a weakened immune response. So something as common, for example, as the common flu, okay, which normally will get us sick, but then we have our immune system build up and amplify to get rid of that virus, influenza virus. For individuals that are, okay, immunocompromised, people that have HIV and AIDS, okay, you cannot call for backup. You cannot now amplify your immune response. So they're more susceptible, okay, to these diseases. All right. All right. So when you activate, you produce effector lymphocytes and also produce memory lymphocytes. So the effectors get rid of the initial problem, okay, the immediate problem. What do memory lymphocytes do? Well, these are the ones, okay, responsible for immunity, right? So they're going to wait within your lymphoid tissues. They're going to wait in your tonsils and your lymph nodes and your spleen and appendix. And they're going to wait there for days to decades. Waiting for what? Waiting to encounter their antigen again. Okay? So when it happens again, let's say you get sick for a third time and a fourth time and a fifth time, okay? Every time you encounter again, your proliferative response, okay? The rate at which you divide and the rate at which you attack are more vigorous and more rapid. All right? So your immune system starts to learn even more, starts to build up and get even stronger. All right? So memory lymphocytes are the basis for acquired immunity. They guard us against subsequent infections and prevent people from getting many diseases more than once. So the reason why we get a vaccine is why? Well, we don't inject a full-blown pathogen into our body. We inject an attenuated form, a weakened form of that pathogen. The thing is, though, that pathogen, okay, even though, okay, it's a weakened form, it's still bearing the same type of antigens that a stronger version of that pathogen would have. Okay, so we get the best of both worlds. Okay, we generate antibodies, we generate, okay, memory lymphocytes to this pathogen. At the same time, we don't get full-blown sick from it because we injected a weakened version of it. Okay? All right. So those are the cells that we find within our lymphatic system. Okay? Well, these cells can be in groups with other cells. We form what are called lymphoid tissues. All right? So lymphoid tissue is a special type of connective tissue. Okay? And we find a lot of them, okay, in terms of where we're going to fight infection. All right? So you're going to find lymphoid tissues in places where you're typically going to fight microorganisms. We're going to fight pathogens. Right? So the two general locations that you find lymphoid tissue are in the mucous membranes. Okay? So these are membranes exposed to the outside environment. Okay? So the mucous membranes of your digestive system, of your urinary system, of your respiratory system, and your reproductive system. Okay? And we call this, in the mucous membranes of these systems, we call it MALT, mucosa associated lymphoid tissue. So here, let's say this is your large intestine, here's your colon, all right? Here's the lumen, this is where the feces would be, right? And here's my mucosa. And in that mucosa, you see this big cluster of dark purple here. Well, that is mucosa associated lymphoid tissue. This is MALT, okay? So what are you going to find in MALT? Well, you're going to find macrophages, you're going to find B cells, you're going to find T cells. So if anything penetrates through the epithelium of your large intestine, we have B cells, T cells, and macrophages ready to go. Ready for an antigenic challenge, ready for an activation, ready for an immune response, okay? So you're basically going to find MALTs in all lymphoid organs except where? Well, except in the thymus, right? So thymus, again, is more like West Point. We're not expecting a battle to occur within that thymus. This is where immunocompetence occurs, right? Not these antigenic challenges. All right, so lymphoid tissue is the main battleground site where most lymphocytes become activated, okay? So again, you find it, right? You find MALT. You also find it, for example, within your lymph nodes, within your spleen, within your tonsils. Okay, so what do we expect to find if I have B cells, T cells, and macrophages? Well, lymphoid tissue is going to have a network of reticular fibers which support and house the T cells and the B cells. All right. So here we see, for example, let's say this is the wall of your small intestine. Okay, so here's where the chyme would be. Here's the epithelium, and here's the mucosa. Well, here we have MALT. We have mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. And let's say we activate, okay? We have an activation. We have an antigenic challenge. You actually can see it here. This large cluster here and here, these are called lymphoid follicles. Okay, these are spherical clusters of densely packed lymphocytes. So what happened here was you had an antigenic challenge. We had a B cell that was activated, for example, and that B cell divides, and as it divides, okay, you can actually start to see this spherical lymphoid follicle be produced. Okay, so towards the periphery of this lymphoid follicle, it's particularly dense. It's a lot darker in purple. Why? Because we're now having, for example, B cells migrating away, okay, and now it's starting to spread out to different parts of your body. At the center, okay, we call that the germinal center right there. This is where what? We had the activation of a single B cell. The B cell became 2, became 4, became 8, 16, divide, and now we have this lymphoid follicle here. All right, so lymphoid tissues are found where? Well, they're found in lymphoid organs. All right, so lymphoid organs are designed to gather and destroy infectious microorganisms. So you have what are called primary lymphoid organs. You also have what are called secondary lymphoid organs. Okay, so the primary, this is where immunocompetence occurs. Okay, so your red bone marrow, where B cells are produced, and your thymus, where T cells gain immunocompetence. Okay, so we talked about those two. So let's concentrate on what? All right, we're going to concentrate. Actually, we talked about bone marrow a lot. We haven't talked about the thymus much. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the secondary lymphoid organs. So this is where the battles will occur. Okay, this is where the antigenic challenges occur. Your lymph nodes, your spleen, your tonsils, right? Your appendix, right? So primary lymphoid organs, this is where immunocompetence occurs. Secondary lymphoid organs, this is where the battles occur, the antigenic challenges. All right, so let's talk about the thymus. All right, so the thymus is found in the superior thoracic region, okay, your chest basically, and your inferior neck, okay, just posterior to your sternum. All right, so here you can see, for example, here's your thyroid cartilage, okay, here's your trachea, okay, here are your lungs, there's your heart. Okay, so your thymus is a bilobed, so it has two-lobed organ. Again, this is where what? This is where immunocompetence of T lymphocytes occur. Okay, so they secrete hormones. We call these thymic hormones that cause immunocompetence. Okay, and the name of those thymic hormones, there's two of them. Okay, the name of those two hormones are thymosin and thymopoietin. Okay, so let's actually write them right here. Thymosin, okay, and thymopoietin. Okay, so these two hormones, okay, are the two hormones that are secreted by your thymus okay, that cause immunocompetence of T lymphocytes. All right, so they're most active in childhood, okay, and the functional tissue atrophies, okay, it shrinks basically as you get older, okay, and it's replaced with very fibrous, fatty tissue. All right, so why is that? Why is this larger in kids and smaller in old people like me? Okay, well, the reason for that is what? Well, as a child, right, you haven't been exposed to very much in terms of pathogens and different types of microorganisms bearing different antigens. So what has to happen? So think of kind of like Beauty and the Beast, right? Where, you know, the Beast brings Belle to the library. Okay, and it's a humongous library, right? Well, think of a newborn as having a humongous library with no books. So what has to happen? Well, you got to start filling those shelves with books, right? You got to start filling those shelves with memory T cells. So as a child, you have a very active thymus. Okay, you're getting sick with things. You're producing brand new memory lymphocytes. You're starting to put, okay, a book on the shelf of your library. But as the older you get, what happens? Well, your library is starting to get filled up a little bit. You got sick a lot of times at this point. You have lots of memory T cells that you've generated in your lifetime. So as the older you get, okay, your thymus gets smaller and smaller and smaller and gets more non-functional. All right. So you have very large thymuses as kids. You have a very small thymus as you get older. All right. So the thymus is composed of a superficial cortex. The outer part is called the cortex. The inner part here is called a medulla. Okay. So the cortex is packed with what? Rapidly dividing T cells gaining immunocompetence. The medulla, okay, contains what are called thymic or Hassel's corpuscles, where what? Where T cells gain the ability to recognize self. Okay, you have to have the ability not to kill your own cells, basically. Okay, so again, the thymus functions strictly in lymphocyte maturation. Okay, the immunocompetence of T cells. Okay, is the only lymphoid organ that does not directly fight against antigens. Okay? All right. So we're going to move on from primary lymphoid organs now to secondary lymphoid organs. Okay? And kind of the main secondary lymphoid organ that you have in your body are the lymph nodes. These are the same ones that we just talked about when we did the lymphatic system. All right? So most antigenic challenges occur within your lymph nodes. All right? So not only are the antigens destroyed, but this is where the main activation of B cells and T cells occurs. All right, so again, feeding a lymph node, we have what are called the afferent lymphatic vessels containing a dirty lymph. Okay, we then enter your lymph node, which has lots of reticular fibers, that has macrophages, it has B cells and T cells, and then we drain the lymph node using our efferent lymphatic vessels, which contain a cleaner lymph. Okay, now towards the outer part, towards the cortex, okay, this is going to contain most of the lymphoid follicles, okay, B cells, okay, you're also going to find some T cells here, okay, towards the medulla, you're going to find both B cells and T cells present within there, okay. Another type of secondary lymphoid organ is the spleen, okay, so the spleen is an unpaired organ. It lies where? Well, it lies in the left superior quadrant of the abdominal cavity, okay, just superior to the stomach, okay. Again, this is the largest of the lymphoid organs right here, okay? And there's two main functions of your spleen. Well, what does it do? Removal of bloodborne antigens. Well, this is the immune system function, okay? So if there's an antigen, if there's a pathogen that enters your blood, which is a bad thing, right? You now have an organ here that actually will then kind of screen that blood looking for pathogens, okay? Its non-immune system function, the spleen, is the removal and destruction of old defective blood cells by macrophages. So if red blood cells, for example, get old, all right, well, this is where we're going to get rid of those blood cells in your spleen. Okay, on a side note, right, the spleen is also the site of hematopoiesis in the fetus, and it also stores platelets throughout your entire lifetime. Okay, so if we do a cross section here, for example, through your spleen, okay, you see it has lots of blood vessels. Okay, you're going to find lots of reticular fibers within your spleen. So we're going to be supporting something, all right? Now, all the stuff you see in red, okay, what we call that red pulp, okay, this is the part of the spleen that's going to get rid of the old, the aged, the defective blood cells, okay? So we're not going to really concentrate on the red pulp. We're going to concentrate on this white stuff that's surrounding your blood vessels. We call that the white pulp, okay? So the white pulp are thick sleeves of lymphoid tissue. So we're going to expect to find MALT here. Not necessarily MALT, I'm sorry. We're going to find B cells here. We're going to find T cells. We're going to find macrophages present there. So we're going to leak out of these blood vessels. And again, if there's any pathogens in our blood, we now have B cells, T cells ready for their antigenic challenge. All right, the next type of secondary lymphoid organ are the tonsils. Okay, so the tonsils are swellings of mucosa that line your pharynx. Okay, you'll also find it, okay, on the posterior part of your tongue, right? And these are very, very small. These are the simplest of the lymphoid organs, okay? So for example, you have the palatine tonsils in yellow. You have your lingual tonsils right here, okay? You have your pharyngeal tonsils, okay, on the roof of your pharynx, okay? You have your tubal tonsils, okay, just behind the openings of your pharyngotympanic tube in your pharynx. All right, so what are these? Well, these are basically just swellings of mucosa, all right? So here we see one of these swellings of mucosa right there, all right? Okay, and leading to that, we see these little passageway. We call this a crypt, all right? So you're going to find lots of MALT present within your tonsils. So if something were to enter, for example, your body, okay, through your nose or through your mouth, right? We now have B cells and T cells waiting for their antigenic challenge. All right, the next type of secondary lymphoid organ is found in your small intestine. We call these the Peyer's patches, or the aggregated lymphoid nodules. So these Peyer patches are basically MALT abundant in the walls of your intestine. Okay, specifically, okay, towards the ileum side of your small intestine. Okay, so remember your small intestine has the jejunum, okay, and it has an ileum. It also has a duodenum, okay, but we find these Peyer's patches, okay, in the distal part, in the ileum part of your small intestine. There's around 40 of them present. Okay, and why do we have that? Well, remember, okay, your small intestine feeds into your large intestine. Your large intestine has lots of microorganisms, right? Okay, and it's possible it passes back through that ileocecal valve. Okay, and if there are pathogens present in your small intestine, we now have these, okay, Peyer's patches, okay, containing B cells and T cells, okay, ready for an antigenic challenge to occur. Okay. All right, another type of secondary lymphoid organ is the appendix. Okay, and the appendix, again, we guys learned this when we did the digestive system. It hangs off what? Well, it hangs off your cecum of your large intestine. Again, your large intestine has lots of microorganisms. Okay, some of them are good, some of them are bad. So just in case we have some bad microorganisms, we now have B cells and T cells, okay, ready again for an antigenic challenge. Okay, so that concludes the lymphatic system and the immune system. All right, we're going to be moving on pretty soon, all right, to the respiratory system, which will mark the end of material for midterm 4. All right, guys, so have a good day, and I'll see you later. Bye.